Thank you very much for taking the time out of your diary this morning to join our webinar on Cyber Essentials. We have imaginatively called this "The Clue is in the Name." And the reason being is that the things that we're going to cover today are concerned about the absolute essentials when it comes to cybersecurity. Now, as a business, we've been, I think, highly hesitant about using webinars during this lockdown period. I don't know about you, but I've got webinar fatigue. However, we asked a number of our customers whether a webinar would be useful, and if so, what topic it should be. And looking at the information that came back, if not top of the list, certainly high up on the majority of respondents was something around cyber essentials. So by popular demand, here we are. What are we going to cover today? And my slides have stopped. There we go. Apologies. What are we going to cover today? Well, overwhelmingly, people wanted to know some level of guidance as to how they could help colleagues internally understand the importance of cyber essentials and why they needed to invest. So after some brief introductions, I'm going to provide you with some of the basics around the Cyber Essentials program before taking a look at what factors you should consider when collating your business case for investment. The second area that we're going to cover is around about hints and tips about what you need to do in order to achieve the certification. So what we'll do is we'll take you through our process for achievement of the standard at the first time of asking. And that's actually where the pressure comes back onto you guys, because to date, we are delighted to say, very proud that we've got 100% first time pass rate. So it's up to you guys to make sure you don't let us down. We're then going to go and cover some learning points and some conclusions before giving you the opportunity to ask some questions. So when it comes to questions, you've essentially got two options. Firstly, you can email myself, which is rpage@ansecurity.com, or you can ask questions using the Q&A function on the Zoom console. So who have we got on the panel today? Well, my name's Richard Page. I'm the Director of Sales and Marketing here at ANSecurity. I'm a newbie to the business. I've been here for a grand total of 7 weeks now. And in my very short time here so far, there's two things that have really stuck out to me. I think the first one is the quality of advice, guidance, and support that our guys give is absolutely excellent. It's second to none. And I think the reason being basically comes down to point number two. Our guys absolutely will love what they do and they don't see it as a job. I'm going to use a for instance here. James, who's going to introduce himself in a second, he's actually gone and invested his own time in running essentially a draft cyber essentials certification on his own home network. And the reason he's done that is to show and understand the value it can provide to organizations of various different sizes. Now, that is a fantastic commitment to us as a business and you to our customers. And as a technophobic Nokia 3210 owner, I think it's pretty impressive. So James, do you want to introduce yourself to the group?
Yeah, sure thing. So I'm James Preston. I joined ANSecurity a little under 2 years ago. Come from a background in the education sector, but since joining ANSecurity have been pretty much everywhere. So across healthcare, government, manufacturing, all organizations that we work with, both small and large, of course. Really enjoy working with the Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus framework in particular. It's great to see organizations adopt an additional security posture in enhancing their own abilities and their ability to defend themselves, and seeing that deliver some real benefit for them in the future. Thanks, Rich.
Fantastic. Just looking at that photo, I have to stress that that is pre-COVID-19. At the moment, I look more like Sandy Toxic, but you know, haircuts will happen one day. So I want to ensure that this session is, I mean, it's as educational as possible, really, and we certainly don't want to make this a blatant sales pitch. However, I think you need to indulge me for a minute just to give you the opportunity to understand a little bit more about our business, and bear with me, it is relevant. Now, the only thing that we do at ANSecurity is security. We don't do anything else. And we've got a really simple motto, which is basically protecting your tomorrow by securing it today. And we do that by providing a whole bunch of services and solutions across that entire end-to-end security spectrum. So from the core infrastructure all the way through to the perimeter and all points in between. And you can see that on the diagram on those top 7 blocks at the top. Now, the reason why this is important and I wanted to highlight it is these 7 areas are typically the areas that most mid-market organizations really need to consider when it comes to improving their security posture. And actually, the Cyber Essentials certification provides a really great framework for enabling this. Now, each of the solutions that we deliver cover the entire end-to-end spectrum, and they can be consumed in different ways. So we can deliver projects to you, we can provide resources for projects that you're running yourself, we can run full services against an SLA, and we've got a fantastic process for making sure that when we are delivering something, wherever possible, we will try and prove that it will work prior for you having to actually financially commit. So, in order to introduce the subject of Cyber Essentials, I just want to bring your attention to thinking about what makes successful organizational structures successful. So how are Apple able every year to go and deliver a conveyor belt of absolutely fantastic consumer products that everybody just laps up? If you look at things like the red arrows in defense, how are they the best display team in the world consistently? And the one that really gets me is British cycling. Every 4 years they manage to peak at exactly the right time when it comes to the Olympics. Now, it doesn't really matter whether you're in the business world, the sporting world, or defense. It really just comes down to a single enduring common characteristic. All of these organizations, they will focus on doing the basics to the very highest possible standards every single time. And there's a lot that we can all learn from that. If you go and take that single common characteristic and apply that to your own security posture, then you can reduce the threat to your business significantly. But threats change, threat actors evolve, and so you need to ensure that as a business, you do the basics to a high standard, but you really double down and make sure you focus on doing it every single time. Now, security is not and never will be a single tick box exercise. We need to go and make sure that it is embedded in everything that we do. So at a real high level, what is Cyber Essentials? Well, it's a government-backed information assurance scheme, which is now run out of the National Cyber Security Centre, which is part of GCHQ, which sounds, quite exciting in itself. But it is all about the essentials. It shows you as a business the basics, how to prevent those most common attacks. It's not a silver bullet solution, but it's really just seen as part of your security journey. Now, I was chatting to one of our customers last week who's just gone through their Cyber Essentials Plus certification again for the second time. And I think they had a great statement that they made. And they said, for me, Cyber Essentials Plus shows the world that I am not the weakest of the pack. And I really get the sentiment of what this lady was saying here, because basically being able to publish your CE or your CE Plus certification in itself is an excellent threat deterrent. Now, Cyber Essentials comes in 2 simple flavors, if you like. The first one is the simple £300 self-assessment option, which is called Cyber Essentials, or you've got the Plus derivative. Now, the Plus derivative requires an on-site audit. Costs vary depending on the size, but you're looking at an investment of around about 1.5 to 5K. Now, as per my previous point, CE and CE Plus do require annual recertifications each year. This isn't a single fire and forget exercise. It's all about baking in lasting security posture improvements. Now, as of the 1st of April, there's only one place that you can go and get that certification, and that is IASME. And at the same time as the change to IASME, there were a number of program revisions that were made, all basically just trying to raise the bar, making it a little bit harder. And we're going to cover that in a little bit more detail so you're up to date. But why else might it be useful? So you could be CE or CE Plus certified. You can benefit for up to £25,000 worth of free cyber insurance. But I think most importantly, it is becoming increasingly mandated, particularly for those that are looking to work with the public sector. Now, when it was announced in 2014, any organisation that was bidding for contracts involving sensitive or personal data needed to go and get that CE standard. But one thing that our customers have found, and also us at ANSecurity as a business, is that the Plus derivative is now becoming mandated for even low-value, small-scale public sector contracts. And that's across central government, it's across local government, and policing as well. And when it comes to the health sector, for those of you that are in health, you'll no doubt be aware that NCSC's mandated that all NHS organisations have got to be on the Cyber Essentials Plus standard and show plans to be able to do that by June 2021. Now, irrespective of what's going on with COVID at the moment, there isn't any evidence to suggest that that deadline is going to extend. Now, the cynics amongst you, and historically I might have put myself in that camp, would have said, well, you know, obviously this is a government-backed thing. Obviously the government are going to be enforcing that, but we really don't see it that way. I think the evidence as to why organisations should adopt Cyber Essentials and why they should do it now is absolutely right in front of us. The key benefit from Cyber Essentials, and I should stress that here at ANSecurity, we wholeheartedly agree with this statement, is that if you just implement the 5 technical controls, and I'm going to go through those briefly in a second, you are going to be stopping the casual attackers. I think more importantly, you're going to be less of an attack threat for those determined attackers. And it's those determined attackers are the ones that cause the real big threats to your organization. So if we look at this common diagram on the left-hand side, which many of you have seen previously, if you are CE or CE plus certified, you're talking about attacking pretty much the majority of those threat actors on the left-hand side, probably with the exception, I would have thought, of nation states and terrorist groups. But, you know, if you've got Al-Qaeda that are coming after your network, then you're going to need a little bit more than Cyber Essentials Plus on your side, I suppose. But in reality, if you implement those 5 technical controls, which we'll talk about, in other words, doing the basics to a high standard and doing it every single time, you're typically going to reduce your organizational risk threat by around about 80%. It's absolute common sense here. So let's go and have a look at those basic threat controls. And the great thing is they're all simple. The first one, there's nothing grand here. It's all about using a firewall to secure your internet connection. There are various different firewall types out there. You can choose from various different vendors depending on the use case you've got, the budget that you have. This session's not about advising you on the best firewall to be able to meet your requirements. However, we've got loads of experience in that area. If you want to reach out to us, we're more than happy to help and have a conversation there. Number 2, choosing the most secure settings for your device and software. Now, I'm probably teaching my grandmother to suck eggs here, but the general rule of thumb is don't just use the manufacturer's basic settings when you get new software and devices. These are almost certainly not designed with security as their primary driver. However, you would probably be amazed at how many businesses do not enforce such a policy. Now, the published data suggests that it's around about 60% of organizations. However, anecdotally, when we chat to our guys who are in the field day in, day out, talking to customers, we reckon it's closer to 90%. And if you look at home users, 94% of home users will just use the manufacturer's basic default settings. So if you think of what's going on at the moment and people potentially using their own devices for doing corporate work and the impact that could have when it comes back onto your network, it's significant. Now, when we're talking about settings, we're also talking about password. And James is going to talk about this in a bit more detail later on because it's really important and fundamentally embedded within Cyber Essentials. However, as a business, at the top level, you've really got to make sure that you've got an effective password policy. And equally importantly, but often overlooked, you've got to go and make sure that it's enforced. And finally, when we're talking about secure devices and software settings, you've really got to go and make sure that you consider additional security features where additional security is required. And for things like this, we're talking about multi-factor authentication, amongst other things. Now, this isn't a session around MFA, but again, if you want advice and guidance on that, then please just reach out to us. Now, number 3, it sounds absolutely simple, and indeed it is. You've got to control who has access to your data and your services. So staff really should just have access to the software and services and settings and devices and connectivity that just gives them enough to be able to go and do their job. If they need extra permission, then it should only be granted to those who really need it and can justify it. And also, you've got to really make sure that you're considering how you control the downloading of software onto the network. You've got to go and make sure that it only comes from official sources. So number 4, taking measures to protect against viruses and malware. Now, most antivirus malware measures are often included for free within, popular OSs. And for your office equipment, you know what, you can be pretty much instantly save it just by clicking enable. However, you've also got to start thinking about strategies for things such as whitelisting and sandboxing as well. And then the fifth security measure, you've just got to keep your devices and software up to date with the latest patching. And when the manufacturer stops supporting that device or that software, then you know what you've got to do. You've absolutely got to make sure you replace it. There is still a staggering amount of people out there that are running Windows XP within a business context. And you know what, worse still, they're using XP without a firewall. Now, that is absolutely not a case of doing the basics to a high standard at all. James is going to talk to you a little bit more about patching later, and particularly the 14-day rule. But I think suffice it to say, there's no such thing as too much patching. Now, when it comes to cyber essentials, we've talked about the basics around technology, but technology on its own is only a part of it. It rarely is the only answer. So there are other things that you need to consider. And the first one is basically business process. If we are looking at embedding long-lasting improvements and baking that into the way that we do things, then that does fundamentally mean that we're going to have process change. We are potentially going to have new tools. We're certainly going to have new ways of doing things. But the great thing about implementing change in any way is that typically, if you do it correctly, if you really consider it, there are significant efficiency changes or financial improvements that you can make through things like automation. But there's no point at all in having great tools and fantastic processes if your staff don't adapt. Employees are generally the weakest link into all organizations. So it's absolutely critical that every single employee within your business understands that their behavior around how the business is protected from cyber threats absolutely needs to change. You've got to think about training and how that's enforced and how it's embedded into human resource management processes, from basic induction when staff come into the business, employment contracts, all the way through to disciplining staff and ensuring that you are able to do something when people do veer off track. Now, we've seen some really great examples from customers of ours who've developed their own almost cybersecurity accreditation for their own internal staff. And that's been a really great way of being able to highlight the importance of cybersecurity, not just to the rank and file staff, but also, more importantly, to the senior leadership within the business, and making sure that they are showing that they are leading by example when it comes to cyber. Now, there's an old adage, what gets measured gets done, and I fully agree with it. It's all very well training your staff, but if you've got no idea of monitoring and measuring to see whether all this training that you're doing has had the required impact on the behavioural change, then you pretty much, you're wasting your time. Now, there's loads of really cool, interesting, and indeed low-cost shrink wrap training and behavioral testing services that you can get on the open market, and we can advise you on those which work well and customers have had good feedback on and so on. They're not just based around things like phishing attacks. There are various different other scenarios, but really generally worthy of consideration. You can't just go and train your staff. You need to go and make sure that that behavior change has been enforced. So those are the very basics, and we're going to go on into some of that in a lot more detail as we go through. But I think when you're looking at the business case and understanding the financials around why you need to invest in something like cyber essentials and cybersecurity in general, then I think we need to go and understand the history about why CE came back in the first place, or CE was invented in the first place. So if we go all the way back to 2014, I think the international community and also the UK government, they could quite easily see the growing threat that cyber threats had on their own systems and their own networks. So ditto, it was very similar to be able to then go and draw the line about the potential impacts and the very clear and present danger that it could present to businesses, consumers, schools, hospitals, pretty much the general fabric of society. And I think, I'm trying not to be crass when I say this, but if you look at what the last few months has clearly shown us is, the impact a malicious body can have on us as a population is significant. And Cyber Essentials, probably without thinking about it, was the UK government's key policy driver to help reduce the risk of what the digital equivalent of where we find ourselves now. And basically, it comes down to numbers. It comes down to common economics. Cyber Essentials made absolutely financial sense to do so. So one of the questions I mentioned at the start that we frequently get asked is, how can I go and get my senior leadership team to understand the importance of cyber security? How can I go and build my own business case to invest in that? Or also how can I go and build an investment case around the adoption of something like Cyber Essentials Plus? And we'd say just look at the numbers. It really comes down to simple cost and risk, and all of the information is pretty much freely available in the public domain. Doing nothing is basically inviting the inevitable. So over the past 6 months or so, I've looked a lot into what is the cost of a breach, and I think the most useful recent in-depth research that I've come across comes from last year from a Ponemon Institute report, a very good authorized resource, and it's entitled Cost of a Data Breach. The report is freely available online. I would encourage you to download it, have a read through. There's some really interesting statistics. Now, it is just about the cost of a data breach, and I do want to be specific around that because obviously there's many other types of breach within a business. However, from me, I think this is the best factual information that you have to hand to support your internal investment discussions around investing in cyber. So, shockingly, the average cost of a data breach, based upon research of, I think it's a little bit more than 500 companies between July 2018 and April 2019, was $3.92 million. That's a heck of a lot of money. And that 3.92 million was made up as those 4 factors that you can see on screen there. So if we look at the 3 o'clock detection and escalation costs, that's a significant component at 1.22 million. But I think that 1.22 million hides something which is even more worrying. It's not just the cost, it's also the time. So in 2019, on average, it took 206 days to identify a data breach and then a further 73 days to contain it. Now, yesterday we had the announcement of EasyJet of 9 million records that have left their network. They were aware of that breach, if public domain information is to be believed. They were aware of that in January. It's taken them nearly until June to be able to publicize that. That is a significant amount of time at a time where people are not flying and revenue is not predictable, that they don't need within their business. The second is concerned around the notification cost. So this is basically, the cost of letting people know that their data has been compromised. The third is around post-breach response costs. So if you think about what's going on with EasyJet employees right now, making sure that they are doing all the right things to redress the situation and repair what's going on, there are significant costs that are being employed there. But the one that really makes people sit up, it's all about lost business costs. It's fairly self-explanatory. It's essentially the cost associated with lost business. But it goes from system downtime, reduced revenue, but significantly, reputational damage is massive. So 3.92 million is a heck of an impact on the overall bottom line performance of any business. And I know we've mentioned EasyJet specifically, a large organization, but when it comes to breach, size really does not matter. Although the total cost of a breach is definitely smaller, the smaller the organization size, the actual cost for employee is significantly higher. So if you are an organization of 25,000 employees, the cost per employee is around about $204. That's the cost of a breach. However, if you are a mid-market organization, and the example we've got here is between 500 and 1,000 employees, that value increases significantly to more than $3,500 per employees. Now, unfortunately, in our 18 years in existence, we have frequently seen customers that have been brought to their knees by, a potential cost per employee of that level. And in some instances, it has wiped them out altogether. And I think the thing that is worse is that this is a clear and ever-present danger. And nearly 30% of organizations that have been a victim of breach think that they are going to be experiencing a similar breach within the next 2 years. And the general expectation is that the likelihood of a major cyber event is probably higher than it ever has been. And there's good justification for that. So the research shows that the importance of security and security posture at a senior level within a business decreases significantly when there are quote unquote other things to worry about. And I think irrespective of what sector your business is in at the moment, you can clearly say there are other things that we need to worry about. Hackers know that. Now, there's a really interesting article last week from Forbes, which you can Google and get access to this. And it predicts that as a result of COVID-19, the next major event is inevitably going to occur within the next 6 months. And that event is going to be the largest in history. It's only a really short read. It's really interesting and really very, very well written. But I think it sums up the business case perfectly. The numbers are painting, the true picture. And it's about as clear as it can get. The costs of a breach are potentially crippling for a business. The likelihood of it happening multiple times is significant. But on the positive side of things, if you just invest doing the basics to a high standard every single time and invest in something like Cyber Essentials or the Cyber Essentials Plus certification, you are going to reduce this risk by around about 80%. So that provides you with a little bit of information around the basics of the program, a little bit of information around useful sources that you can look to go and build your business case. I'm going to pass over to James now, and what he's going to do is be able to go and give you some hints and tips about things that you can practically do in order to make sure that you are reducing your risk by that 80%.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rich. So just swap out the screens there. Grand stuff. So first, we're going to have a brief look at the changes that have been made from this switch to IASME. So previous to the 1st of April 2020, a date of which of course has already gone by, the NCSC arranged it such that the previous 5 accreditation bodies would be consolidated down into a single accreditation body, and that's IASME. Now, they started this process way back in 2019, with this being announced, of course, in October of 2019. Now, there's a bit of a saving grace there. So if you've already started your process through getting accredited with one of the previous assessment bodies, as accreditation bodies, you can continue to do so if you've already paid up for it and you're working through your questions. And you've got until the 30th of June 2020 to complete that process. Now, the aim for consolidating down from 5 different accreditation bodies to just the one was to deliver an increased amount of consistency across the entire program. So although the NCSC was setting the broad goals, the 5 technical control areas, each accreditation body was setting their own set of questions and setting their own set of technical tests. And there was just starting to become a bit of a disparity between the way that the process was actually being implemented across the board. Now, as Rich alluded to earlier, this has brought about some significant benefits as well. One in particular, IASME is now offering a certain amount of cyber security insurance should you be breached. And this is proportional to the size of your organization, of course, and the technical details about that are available on their website. So skipping forwards there, we're going to have a quick look at the process that we use when we take our customers through a Cyber Essentials or a Cyber Essentials Plus assessment. Now, as a business, we apply a 5-step process to pretty much all the work that we do. We've had to make some minor changes to that for the Cyber Essentials program, but on the whole, we have a discover phase, a design phase, a notion of proving whatever we have recommended is actually going to work for you, install and configure, and then look towards the future. Now, mapping that into the Cyber Essentials process, we have a pre-assessment. This is where remotely or through coming to site, we will carry out the same assessment that any formal assessment would be. And that includes answering the questions and going through the technical tests. We then produce a comprehensive gap analysis report, and we'll have a look at the information that's provided in that report a little bit later in this presentation. Next up is the remediation phase, and this is where, based upon the information in the gap analysis report, we look at the issues that you might have and what you need to do to solve those problems. And of course, as we've been doing this for a number of years now, we've started to build up a kind of a database of the most common issues. And for expediency, what we'll actually do as part of this presentation is take you through some of those common issues. You then progress on to actually getting your assessment and indeed all being well passing as well and getting your accreditation. And then look towards the future. So reassess every year as required as part of the program, or indeed look to take it to the next level with additional accreditations. So the pre-assessment phase. For this, we come to site typically for 1 or 2 days, depending on the size of the organisation. We work through the questions and we perform the technical tests as well. Now, the questions that are set out by ASME are indeed available through their website, publicly available. You don't even have to enter your email address into someone's CRM database to get hold of them, so do feel free to have a look at those. And what we'll do is we'll take you through those questions and get the responses recorded in a spreadsheet that we use. And also, whilst we're going through the question phase, we'll look to back up anything that you've said with a certain degree of evidence. So what we see here in particular is that organisations that do go and suffer the breach, when the ICO comes knocking at the door, they're not just going to ask you to say, have you been doing these things? They are going to be asking you to prove that you've been doing these things. And as part of our assessment phase, we look to preempt a certain measure of that, of course. There are a series of technical tests that we then perform, and we'll cover these in some more detail in a couple of minutes' time, but on the whole, it's relating around email delivery, Nessus scans, file downloads, and looking at the malware and anti-malware services that you're using in your organization. The length of time and the number of people that we need to pretty much directly relates to the size of your IT organization. If we're working with an organization that's maybe got half a dozen or less IT staff, typically it's just a 1-day engagement. And most of the time we only need to speak to 1 or 2 people to get all the responses and all the access that we require. Of course, as we scale this up, in particular to organizations like NHS trusts, for example, organizations which have dozens of IT staff potentially, typically we look at a 2-day engagement for this phase, and then normally we need to speak to 3 or 4 people to get all the right answers, or to get the answers to the questions that we need. So Rich has already alluded to the 5 areas of technical control. It's important to understand there's an element of scaling involved in your response to each of these technical controls. So if we were to single out the firewall aspect there, the way that the Cyber Essentials program is written is it is indeed possible for the smallest coffee shop up to the largest organization to be able to pass it. But there's an understanding that you need to scale your response to each of those questions depending on the size of your organization as well. So a small coffee shop, they'll have their BT Business Hub router, for example, and that will operate as their firewall. And just by logging into that once a year, for example, they'll meet their requirements. Whereas a larger organization with an enterprise-grade firewall, perhaps from Palo Alto Networks, FortiGate, or any of the other vendors, there's more emphasis placed upon the audit processes which you have to have in place there. And of course, that directly scales the size of your organization. If you've done a Cyber Essentials assessment in the past, in particular with an organization that wasn't IASME, you might have remembered that there would have been yes/no responses to some questions, or sometimes maybe always. It's important to understand that those have effectively gone now. IASME are looking for a written description, sometimes just 1 or 2 sentences, sometimes just a little bit more in each of your questions. As I've already mentioned, it really helps to have evidence to back up anything that you say in your questions phase. And what you'll find is sometimes that evidence will be stored in a ticketing system or a knowledge management system or a wiki, for example. Now, there's about 12 questions in each of those 5 areas, and out of those questions, a large majority of them are based upon technical controls. So things which you can just go and click a button or make some changes to some configuration settings to actually implement and meet the needs of. But it's important to understand that a number of them are also based around documentation and that audit processes that we've mentioned already. In particular, if we take firewalls again as an example, you need to have business cases written out for each of your rules. And some people look at that as a very onerous process, but in reality, it allows us to legitimize the existence of that firewall. And most of the time, it's just going to be a one-time process with a review of it, perhaps once every quarter, every 6 months, or a year, depending on the risk that that rule introduces to your environment. If we then look on at the technical tests which are performed, there's 3 core areas here. So a vulnerability scanner, investigating the anti-malware or whitelisting or sandboxing defenses which you have, and then also sending round via email and web browsers some file samples. If we look at the vulnerability scanner, as part of the process, there is an external vulnerability assessment. And it's also just important to understand that these areas apply to the C+ assessment only. If you're just doing the Cyber Essentials assessment without the plus element, these won't apply to you. But equally so, when we come to site, we can still run these tests to help you gauge any future ability should you wish to move up to C+ assessment. So for that vulnerability scanner, we've got that remote assessment, and we've got a flow chart, a scoring matrix, which is used to determine if that vulnerability is going to be a pass or fail for this element of the test. The same then applies against a authenticated scan, against a sample, a representative example of the devices inside your network. And this is where things like having that 14-day patching rule really comes to the foreground. So one of the key aspects is that any vulnerability which is rated at high or critical on CVSS scoring matrix must be patched within 14 days of that vulnerability going live from the vendor. We'll have a look at what that means in a little bit more detail in just a couple of minutes' time. We then move on to anti-malware side of things. So we'll be looking at whatever anti-malware, antivirus agents that you've got deployed. What we're looking for there is that if the manufacturer is releasing updates on a regular basis, that you've applied any of those AV updates within 24 hours of actually being released by the vendor there. And equally so, engine updates need to be applied within 30 days of release. If you are using a combination of anti-malware and whitelisting or sandboxing, or perhaps just using whitelisting by itself, we'll also be looking to test that that is indeed functioning correctly and is indeed applied correctly. When it comes to the email and browser tests, so here it's a case of emailing round a series of sample files and attempting to download a series of sample files through any browsers that you have deployed in your environment. There's 3 kind of core groups of the samples that we'll use. So a malware sample, this is a truly non-malicious file, but that should be detected by most anti-malware, antivirus agents as being malicious. And it's important to note that those files need to be totally blocked. There should be no way for those files to reach your endpoints. This is very similar to the ICAR test files, if you've seen them in the past or used them in the past. When it then comes to the executable side of things, so what we're looking for there is to make sure that the user is at least 1 click away from actually running that executable. It can't be a case of if you've got that open in an email and you know, in simple case of double clicking that the executable will immediately run. That's an immediate hard fail in those cases. There needs to be some other step. And of course, what we might find there is it's simpler for organizations to simply block the download of executables, MSIs, PowerShell scripts, DMGs if you're using Macs to achieve this part of the accreditation. Of course, there's going to be exceptions there. So, you know, an IT department for the purpose of deploying updates, exceptions will need to be made, but, you know, we're very mindful of those, and the program itself is very mindful of those. There's a series of other file tests which go through as well. So these will be zip files, for example. And in one of those cases, there'll be sample malware file inside that zip file. Again, that needs to be blocked at source. And equally so, things like Word documents, Excel documents with macros and such like. There needs to be a measure of those being tested as part of this phase. When it comes to browsers, all browsers get tested. So this is a key opportunity that if you're not using it in your environment, to disable any unused browsers or any browsers which you're not updating. For example, in particular, old Internet Explorer, Microsoft Edge. If you're not using those, perhaps your organization is purely a Google Chrome or a Firefox organization, disable, remove those browsers, and that way those don't need testing. They don't need patching as part of this process. So moving on to the gap analysis phase. So for this, we will deliver you a comprehensive PDF report which covers your responses to each of the questions, as well as identifying a series of projects which you need to do to close the gap, to get you from where you are right now to be able to pass your Cyber Essentials assessment. Now, along with the PDF file, which of course is your version to print off and take to meetings and look good with, you also get a copy of Excel documents. So in one of those Excel documents, it'll be your responses to the questions. This is very handy if you want to go and copy and paste that into your later assessment. And equally so, a Excel version of the projects which you need to undertake. Our customers really like this aspect as it allows them to take that information, put it straight into whatever project management service they're using without having to copy and paste out of a PDF and lose formatting and get all those nasty bits that come in with copying and pasting out of a PDF. Now, along with any Nessus reports which are relevant to your assessment, these will be securely transferred to you. We've got a file transfer service which we use for that purpose. And equally so, if you prefer that we use any service that you've got yourself, we're more than happy to do that too. And it'll be about a week later, after we've delivered this report, we'll be looking to have a follow-up phone call just to talk you through any of the questions that you might have, or indeed look to assist you with any of the areas inside that report. Now, a lot of our customers in the past have come to us and said, well, where do we need to start? What's the biggest risks that we've got? So each of those projects inside the report will be scored from 1 to 3 against both risk and complexity. For the risks, level 3 is a high level risk. You are exposing your organization to a high degree of risk by not implementing this control yet. You need to get this underway as soon as possible. And equally so, a low level risk, perhaps you've already got some technologies or some processes in place which are helping to mitigate this, but you just need to take it up a notch, 1 or 2 levels, such that you can get those risks mitigated. The same applies against complexity as well. What we sometimes see here is that the large complexity changes that are required is our customers will reach back to us and say, hey, can you help us out with these areas? Perhaps deploy some additional technologies or make some process changes as required for us. All the way down to the level 1 complexities where it's a relatively trivial change. Perhaps it's just a group policy object that needs changing or tweaking. Perhaps that object is a well-known good change. Lots of organizations deploy it, and it's very easy for you to go out and roll out. The next phase, of course, is remediation. For most reports that we've delivered over the last year or two in particular, we normally have a list of between 10 and 15 remediations with an even spread across risk and complexity. So you've got that list of projects to kick off. It's then important to establish timelines against those, in particular if you need to meet your CE+ accreditation by a specific date, map that towards that. And equally so, if you do need any assistance in delivering any of those remediations, get in touch with us. We are more than happy to help. And what you'll find is that in your remediation report, in your gap analysis report, we'll make suggestions on technologies, process changes, group policies, for example, that can be implemented to help deliver those changes as required. So once you've completed your initial remediation, you then should be looking to build processes around those in the future, such that as you come along to your yearly renewal of Cyber Essentials, it's just a case of reading information or obtaining a report to be able to prove that you are indeed doing the things that are asked in the questions. So that brings us quite nicely into common pitfalls. So as I mentioned, we've been doing this for a fair few years now. We've got our database effectively of the common issues that we see. What I'd like to do is just present a couple of those to you guys such that you can perhaps avoid these if you wish to go through the process in a later date. So the first one is purely and simply have an inventory. So it's impossible to secure what you don't know you don't have. And what we see here is that this is actually tackled very early on in the set of questions. So you'll be asked, how many laptop computers do you have? What version of Windows are they running? How many desktop computers? How many mobile phones do you have? What version of Apple iOS are they running? What you might sometimes find is if you don't have this information available to hand, or if you're not recording this information suitably at the moment, that it can be handy to build this database, build this set of information, not just for your Cyber Essentials assessment, but also for any inventory assessment against insurance as well, of course. Looking at a couple of the free and paid for solutions there, we see a lot of people still just using an Excel spreadsheet. And if you're a small organization, an Excel spreadsheet is a really handy way to just keep track of your inventory. If you're a pure Windows house, there's some PowerShell scripts which you can execute against some domain controllers. So I've got an example at the bottom there, which will give me the name of the client, the operating system version, the description of that client. And what you'll see as well in there in the operating system version number, 17134, actually maps to the version number of Windows 10 1803. So it's very easy to obtain this information. Paid for side, services like Manage Engine, PDQ, Inventory, your MDM service, or perhaps even just an AV console can quite regularly collect the information that you need for this element of the assessment. Next up is document and review your processes. So again, taking firewalls as an easy example there, one of the things is that every firewall rule needs to have a business case assigned against it, and that those business cases should be reviewed at appropriate intervals. So what we suggest to organizations here is perhaps using your service desk, or again, an Excel spreadsheet with your Outlook calendar, just something like that, which can kick off processes. It fires an email into the service desk. That's automatically assigned against whoever looks after the firewall. And once every 6 months, once every year, they check through the firewall rules and just sign it off inside the ticket that it is indeed an appropriate rule. We should still be using it. It does still have a business case. Knowledge management wise, we still see a lot of organization using Word documents as knowledge management. That may well work well for you if you're a smaller organization, but truly have a look at wiki services. So internally, for example, we use Confluence from Atlassian, great piece of software. There's loads of free examples out there as well. I've seen Drupal even used as a content management system to manage that knowledge. Next up is password and credential management. Now, I cannot enforce or reinforce so much as to how important it is to have good password and credential management as part of a CE Plus or a CE assessment. If we look at the IASME question sheet, there are no less than 28 mentions of the word password alone. And as part of the assessment, they require you to have a minimum of 8 characters as your password length. What we'd say there is be guided by the experts. So organizations like the NCSE, SANS, and even Microsoft through the security baselines are now looking at minimum password lengths of 14 or more. And equally so, you should not be rotating passwords, or indeed even better use passphrases, unless you know that there's been a compromise. So what we see a lot of organizations still sticking with is a 90-day password change. Now, technology is advanced, and services like Have I Been Owned, for example, by registering your domain can alert you if there's been a known compromise against an account. That's the time to enforce a password change. And of course, you can use automation services to perhaps when you get that alert that an account has been compromised, to go and enforce a password change against that user. And there's plenty of services, group policy, multi-factor authentication, modern identity providers, all of which have brilliant tools which can be used to enforce these policies. There's rate limits, making sure that an account is blocked out after 10 or perhaps even fewer password fails. Next up is having a standard OS build. Now, a lot of organizations will come to us and ask, well, how many computers do we need to run the internal assessments against? And to be honest, if you are the kind of organization which is taking a new computer out of the box, joining it to the main, installing your software on it, and then throwing it out to the users, you're probably going to need a significant quantity of your computers to be tested. And that's simply because the vendors might have installed additional software on those computers, and perhaps you're not managing that, perhaps you're not patching that, keeping it up to date, for example. Dell, HP, all such vendors, if they're shipping you out of the box standard computers without applying a standard OS build process against them, you're going to have some issues there. So if you can adopt a service, FreeWise, Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, absolutely brilliant. It allows you to roll out a Windows operating system image to your computers, apply the device drivers required to make it work, install your antivirus software, get it licensed, join to the domain, all in the space of a standard task sequence. You can roll a new computer out in 30 minutes or less in some cases, depending on how you've used it. And of course, if you've got services like System Center Configuration Manager or Microsoft Intune, they can all be used to have a standard OS build process, such that when your assessor comes to site, your representative sample of computers is legitimately just going to be 1 or 2 machines, making the whole process a lot easier for you. The next one is not just getting good at patching, but getting great at patching. I've already mentioned you need to have those high and critical security updates deployed to your computers within 14 days of release from the manufacturer. And this is one of those hard fails inside the assessment, inside the question sets. There's sometimes where there's a bit of leeway allowed, but if you are allowing your computers, if you are allowing your operating systems and applications to go unpatched, months at a time that we've seen in some cases, it's a hard fail against the assessment. And what we suggest you do there is start getting subscribed to the update notifications. So Microsoft SANS through the daily Internet Storm Center's Stormcast, brilliant service there, and other vendor bulletins, get subscribed to those so you're in the know when those patches and updates are released. Of course, quite recently over the last couple of months, Netscaler and Pulse have all had some very high profile vulnerabilities which were easily solved by patching but went unremediated by a lot of organizations, which resulted in credential theft and loss of revenue for their organizations. FreeWise, as far as rolling these updates out, you've got group policy if you're a small organization, just using Windows Update for Business, WSUS if you're a slightly larger organization, or indeed, an MDM solution, something like Intune or Manage Engine PDQ Deploy. And it's all important as well that once you roll out those patches, that you verify that they have indeed been applied. All too often, we go and run the initial Nessus scan and software is perhaps missed. Perhaps people didn't have an up-to-date inventory as they thought they did, and we still identify other applications that are out of date. Getting a hold of a Nessus license for a year, and indeed perhaps renewing that in the future, can really help you identify any of those niche use cases inside your environment. Now, the key one which a lot of people come to us with is how are we going to manage our legacy systems? And just as we have here, perhaps £250,000 or plus worth of kit, maybe it's running off a computer which has some very specific, very legacy software that only runs on Windows XP or even indeed Windows 7 now. And how does that apply to the Cyber Essentials framework? How does that apply to your assessment? Well, to start out with, these devices are not going to meet your 14-day requirements for updates. So they need to be out of scope. And there are plenty of ways of removing a device from scope, but it's important to understand you still need to have a plan to migrate away in the future, perhaps by replacing that computer, getting updated version of the software as finances and such like allow. Sometimes it's a simple case of wrapping that device up in its own VLAN, removing access to the internet, and then using your firewall or other similar services to allow only specific access to specific network resources to and from that device, only the bare minimum that's required to enable it to continue to function as normal. Now, the NCSC, if you have a quick Google for obsolete platform security guidance, they have some brilliant information on how you can reduce the likelihood and how you can reduce the impact of a compromise against that device, and equally so how it can be pushed out of scope for your eventual assessment. So that brings us on to the assessment phase. This is arranged through IASME. Through IASME, you then nominate a partner or your assessor. They come to site, and indeed, as part of the COVID-19 situation that we're in at the moment, there are options for remote assessments to be carried out as well. And indeed, if you're just doing the plain old Cyber Essentials instead of the Cyber Essentials Plus, it is just a case of submit your responses to the questions, and all being well, you pass. That brings us quite nicely, of course, into the future. So you should then be looking to stay compliant, keep compliant. Every year, you will then go through the same process. And this is why we suggest that you build processes around the Cyber Essentials questions. Make it so that the next time you come to needing to answer those questions, it is a case of pulling off a report from your systems. Now, in some cases, there will be some cultural changes required, perhaps taking a bit more of a security mindset. And this is why we really like the Cyber Essentials program. It just allows a lot of organizations that first tip in the toe of the water of cyber security, getting their staff into a bit more of a mindset around security. And if I haven't said it enough already, look to automate as much as you possibly can. Use automated reporting and tools to get that information ready for your next assessment. So conclusions from me, looking kind of your next steps. If you'd like to have a Nessus scan on us against your public infrastructure, absolutely fantastic. It's always really interesting to see what's out there on the internet. And equally so, even if you're running your own Nessus scans and would like a third party to have a look at what they see from their side, get in touch with us. We can deliver that to you as a brief report, again, securely transferred. Now, if you like what you see and the information that we've provided to you there has been valuable to you, we're here to take it to the next level. We're here to take you through this assessment process and get you ultimately certified. So that's all from me. Let's head on to questions there, Rich.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, James. So I've got some interesting ones here, which I'm going to just try and bundle up a bunch of them together into one. So it's a scope question. What devices are in scope? We've got Surface hubs. Other people have mentioned mobile phones and also guest networks. What can you clarify on that for us?
Yep. So it's a case of things like guest networks. You're not managing the devices inside those networks, and as long as those networks are effectively treated as the internet. So what we've seen in some cases, a guest network allows you to directly reach domain controllers or web servers, for example, inside an environment. That's a big no-no. But if you're treating that guest wireless network, for example, as truly an isolated and segregated environment, that's out of your scope. When it comes to devices, here we are looking for your Windows computers, your laptops, your tablet PCs, if they're running Android or iOS, for example. All of those devices are going to be in scope, in particular for things like patching, for example. Now, network equipment, it is exclusively limited to routers and firewalls as well.
Okay, fantastic. So I've got a couple of patching questions. So the first one, how strict is the 14-day patching? Previously with Crest, there was flexibility due to the size of the environment. We patch within the month.
Yep. So IASME have really taken it to the next level here. I'm just scrolling through the question document actually to get you the precise wording, but it is a case of you need to be patched. You need to have the high and critical security updates patched within the 14 days. So it is a case of that applies to applications as well. I see another question about that relating to applications. And this is why we say having a standard build process really helps. If you've got Office applications, tools, line of business applications, within 14 days of that vendor releasing a high or a critical security update, that patch needs to be applied. Now, it's important to discern the difference between security updates and feature updates, of course. So feature updates which don't offer any additional security benefits, that doesn't apply. For the 14-day rule, we are exclusively looking at high and critical security vulnerabilities. So if I take the precise wording here from the IASME questions, you must install any such updates within 14 days in all circumstances. That is absolutely in the clear, and that is relating to your high and critical security updates for not just operating systems, but your software and firmware as well.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. So can I answer yes to questions that we are about to remediate for CE certification before we get CE+?
Okay, so when you submit your responses to your CE Plus assessment, that needs to be a snapshot in time of where you are right now. So if you go and submit those questions and you say, well, we're going to be sorting this out in a month, and you get a compromise or a breach between you submitting those questions and that time that you've actually gone and remediated it, you're not going to be covered by any of the support of the Cyber Essentials framework. You're not going to get your insurance payback effectively there from IASME, for example.
Okay, fantastic. So I've got one about the Nessus scan. Right, how do I paraphrase this? Basically, when can I get one? So I can probably answer that. If you reach out to your account manager, we should be able to go and schedule that in within the next couple of weeks. And then what we probably do at the same time is schedule in time for the follow-up call. Anything you want to add to that, James?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. We'll always like seeing Nessus scan results. We not always find things, but when we do find things, usually it's quite easy to remediate. Of course, changing settings, tweaking things, updating things. Of course, out-of-date versions of Apache and PHP. All too often we see.
Cool, excellent.
Yeah, got another question here, Rich, as well. So if you're running infrastructure, apps and service for third parties, for example, clients, so perhaps if you're a managed service provider there on your network, can you exclude those from your scope? So it's important to understand that when you remove something from scope, that is reflected on your final questionnaire. That is reflected on your final certification. Now, if it's a case of those client infrastructure, those pieces of kit are directly accessible from your internal network, you should be considering those as scope, as within scope. However, if you are treating those devices as if they were out on the public internet, so applying security profiles on your firewall, for example, doing SSL decryption, IPS, technologies which are going to prevent successful cyber attacks, then you can look at removing those devices from scope. Equally so, scoping is always a complex one to answer correctly without further information. So if you do have some scoping questions, get in touch with Rick or your account manager, and we can look through those.
Fantastic. Well, I think we've run out of time now. There's a couple of questions which we've had through, which we will go and they're fairly simple to respond to. So we will go and answer those. If you need a recording of this webinar, please just let us know. We can go and circulate that for you. But it just leaves me to say thank you very, very much for your time. If you do want to take us up on the option of that free Nessus scan and then having a follow-up call with James or one of his colleagues, then please just reach out to your account manager. They'd happily go and talk you through all of that. And equally, some of the other things that we've mentioned in terms of that end-to-end security spectrum, if there's anything else that you'd like to get some advice and guidance on, give us a call. We'd be happy to help wherever we can do. So thank you very much for your time. Have a safe rest of the day, and we look forward to speaking to you all again soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you all. Cheers.